So Ashley Lubinsky, one of the America's foremost authorities on firearm history, is on next to talk about mental health.
But first, self-defense and emergencies can happen to anyone, and there is no guarantee that the justice system will be on your side. Make sure you are protected for the legal battle after your self-defense battle. While you protect your family and property, U.S. Law Shield is here to defend you 24/7, 365 days a year with a comprehensive self-defense coverage at an affordable price. Bad guys don't take days off, and neither does our coverage. Listeners get a free T-shirt when you go use their code Gun Owners Radio. So sign up today. Go to uslawshield.com.
So our next guest is Ashley Lubinsky, and I know her from our court case where we're a plaintiff, and she was this was our assault weapon ban court case, and she was an expert witness and did an awesome job, and got to sit down and have a hamburger with her during the court case, and found out just how impressive she is and what an expert she is. Ashley, how you doing?
I'm doing really good. How are you guys?
Fantastic. So tell people a little bit about who you are and where your expertise comes from.
Yeah, so that's always a very complicated question, but I heard you guys say that Ashley of the Cody Firearms Museum, but that's formerly Cody Firearms Museum. For those who don't know me, I'm a firearms historian. I spent the last 10 years running the Cody Firearms Museum, which is one of the largest gun museums in the country. I rebuilt it while I was there. We did a $12 million renovation, and now I do a little bit of everything with firearms history. So I'm rebuilding a couple of museums right now with major gun collections. I do expert witness testimony, as you just pointed out. I do a lot of writing. I do some TV. I produce a couple of TV shows. So essentially, if it's firearms and history related, I probably have a hand in it somewhere.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so the Cody Firearms Museum, that's in Cody, Wyoming, right?
Correct.
So talk about, if you could, just talk a little bit about, because I thought that's like the mecca for firearms museums. Is there one bigger, better?
Oh, that's a good question. In the United States, there is a bigger collection of public collection. There's a lot of bigger private collections, but a bigger public collection in Claremore, Oklahoma, the J.M. Davis Museum. But it's not as renovated of a museum, but the collection, I think it's around 20,000 maybe, and we're around 7,000. I might be wrong on my numbers. It's been many years. But then the NRA Museum, the Cody, and the Smithsonian all have about the same number of firearms within their collection. Cody's the only accredited firearms museum in the United States, though.
I didn't know. So the Smithsonian has a firearms museum or a firearms branch of their
I had to be very careful the way I phrase that. They have a firearms collection. So
okay.
I worked there for 3 years, and the unfortunate part about it, and years ago when I was there, they actually wanted to do more with the firearms collection, but they do have 7,000 firearms, but unfortunately only about 200 of them are on display throughout all of the Smithsonian museums.
I know the Smithsonian from the D.C. area. Is that where this all is?
The Smithsonian Network. The gun collection is in the National Museum of American History.
I didn't know that. I've been there a bunch.
Yeah.
I've been there a bunch. My parents lived. My dad was stationed in D.C. for a long time. I used to go there. Used to go to the Smithsonian's all the time. I didn't know that they had a firearms section, but it's so easy to. I mean, there's so much going on with the Smithsonian.
It's not on display. They've got the firearms. So there's the collection, and then there's the firearms are on display throughout the museum.
All right, I feel better.
So there's without getting, you're right. Without getting too into the weeds about museum stuff, a lot of museums have moved more towards immersive experiences, educational experiences. So instead of having a museum or a gallery that's dedicated to one type of artifact, you get them kind of interspersed throughout. And in a lot of museum cases, you get a lot fewer artifacts and a lot more interpretive elements.
That's interesting.
So
I think it's terrible, but I wanted people to understand just how big and awesome the Cody Firearms Museum is. I mean, like I said, in my opinion, it's the firearms museum in the United States, and you were such a big part of making them successful. How did that happen? How did you go to work for the Cody Firearms Museum?
So the Cody Firearms Museum, and like I said, it's a large collection. It has around 7,000 firearms, and it spans 700 years of history. So they've got about 30,000 artifacts and then 7,000 individual firearms. But that museum collection is actually a Smithsonian affiliate, which really doesn't mean a ton. It's just like a cool little logo that you get to put on your website. But it meant a lot to me when I was at the Smithsonian. I was actually able to meet with the curator at the time of Cody while I was still in my first summer with the Smithsonian. And then after I met him, I went back out and I worked with the Smithsonian spring, fall while I finished undergraduate and graduate school, and then worked for Cody summer, winter, because University of Delaware, where I went, had a 6-week winter session. So I was able to work twice a year in Cody before I moved there full time.
And was firearms just something you were interested in growing up, or what sparked your interest in firearms?
Not at all, actually. I'm from Pittsburgh, so a lot of people assume that I grew up around firearms because it's very much a part of the culture of Western Pennsylvania. But I actually spent my whole life wanting to be a doctor. I spent my childhood in and out of the hospital for a while. I had over 10 orthopedic surgeries. And so my whole life I was going to be an orthopedic surgeon. And I got into college at Delaware. And within my first semester, I had shifted my major to history because I was interested in the history of battlefield medicine. And my mom, who is a physics teacher, told me that I better have a job when I graduated, which is not always something that happens in history majors. So after that,
you can't just go down to the
studying
history factory and pull a lever and create. No, that's okay.
You don't even know if you want to at some point, because you're not going to be rich if you want to be a museum professional. But I switched my major to history. I studied ballistics and battlefield medicine initially, and then I got an internship at a military museum where I'm from in Pittsburgh. And during that internship, I had to handle and identify what was modified on about 200 different guns for mostly the Civil War period.
Wow.
And I was 18 and I had never held a gun before in my life. So it was a trial by fire, I guess. And I just got hooked during that internship. And so I shifted my focus to firearms specifically.
Wow. Okay. So you're not just an enthusiast. I mean, you're a nationally known, probably internationally known expert when it comes to firearms, and it's turned into a personal interest of yours. And like I said, you and I met, I don't know if you remember me, but you and I met when you were testifying in front of Judge Benitez in the Miller case, the assault weapons case, and you just did an outstanding job. It was I can't even explain. I wish people could see your testimony, because you just did an outstanding job. Such a professional, so well spoken, and so knowledgeable.
Now she should be a lawyer.
Yeah, well.
Oh, no.
I think she's too smart for that.
I threaten it periodically, and my husband's like, no, you make money now. You don't have to pay for law school.
So tell us, why I wanted to set all this up. I wanted to talk about your background and who you are and set all this up. But that's not really what we have you on to talk about. We have you here to talk about mental health and firearms. So why is mental health an important topic for you?
Well, it's personal to me. For a lot of my adult life, I had thought that I suffered from depression, and I had some therapists when I was in Cody who had diagnosed me with that, but I hadn't actually gotten medicated for it until I moved to Arizona. I was on a antidepressant called Cymbalta for pain. Like I said, medical disaster. And so when I found a psychiatrist in Arizona, they actually upped my dosage of Cymbalta, which is used for both. And I had a very adverse reaction to increasing the antidepressant. And it ultimately, it was determined that I have what's called bipolar 2 disorder. And if you are someone who has bipolar 2, it basically masks major depression, because there is no mania in bipolar 2 like people think with traditional bipolar 1. You just have what's called hypomania. So most people just think you're incredibly passionate or really interested in something. And so because of that, most people with bipolar 2 get diagnosed with depression. But what happens is if you have bipolar 2 and you get antidepressants, it basically is a train wreck in your brain, and it causes you to have all kinds of issues and fall out from it. And so as a result of that, I learned that I had something that I never knew I had. And so I kind of spent the past year, actually, I was diagnosed last November, right around Thanksgiving. It spent the past year kind of trying to figure it out in my own head and what that meant for me personally, but then also communicating it with, the gun community, because you do hear a lot of kind of good and bad things within the gun community about mental health. And so I wanted to understand it from my end. And then I also wanted to see if there was a way that I could help being a public figure within the gun community. Because one of the hardest things you have to deal with when you get a mental health diagnosis like having bipolar 2 is you have to realize that you're the same person you were before it. And the diagnosis means that you can now handle it and mitigate it better. But, you certainly kind of go through a dark patch where you don't really think that you're I don't know how to phrase it. I'm new to talking about it, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, you go through a dark patch of, this is what's wrong with me, and not that, this disorder I have is something that has helped to make me very successful. I just need to know how to manage it in order to live a happy and healthy life.
Well, it's interesting that you were already on an anti-depression medication to alleviate pain. And I guess that was just kind of a coincidence. And they said, well, gee, you're dealing with this pain issue. You're already taking this for pain. Why don't we just up it, and it'll hopefully, two birds with one stone. Is that kind of the thinking?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. When I was younger, when I was like 18, one of my pain management doctors, I've got arthritis and all kinds of stuff, but one of my pain management doctors wanted to put me on Cymbalta for pain back when I was 18, and I actually refused it because it was an antidepressant. And I had told my mom at the time, this is so weird, I had told my mom at the time, I'm like, they always say that in the, 18 to 25 age range on Cymbalta or some antidepressants, but there's like a tiny percentage of people who are on antidepressants where it goes terribly. And I was like, I feel like that's me. I had no idea why. I just was like, I feel like this is a bad choice for me. Jeez. So I didn't go on it. I went on a different medication that didn't ultimately work either. But when I was 18, and so then when my rheumatologist recommended it, when I was still in Wyoming, towards the end of my time in Wyoming, I gave it a shot, and at a low dose, it really wasn't bad. It did help with the pain, but because I had the depression diagnosis, they figured it could do both, and instead it did neither.
It did neither.
Well, selling your home feels overwhelming? Well, hey, it doesn't have to be that way with Scott Vinson from Coldwell Banker Royal Realty. Scott Vinson is the perfect guy to help you sell or buy your home. Scott has also been a San Diego County Gun Owner board member from the start. So if you're moving, let fellow Second Amendment supporter and real estate broker Scott Vinson help you sell your home and find your new home anywhere in the United States. Call him today at 619-948-2459. Tell him you heard about it on Gun Owners Radio. Call Scott at 619-948-2459. or online at scottvinson.com.
So we're talking to Ashley Lubinsky, and we're talking about what an expert she is when it comes to firearms. She worked for the Cody Firearms Museum. She's an expert witness. She's not just an expert, but she's also personally interested in firearms, and was diagnosed with a. How do you describe it, Ashley? You said you were diagnosed with.
It's called Bipolar 2, so it's a variation on what's Bipolar 1, which is what people think is traditional bipolar. Bipolar 2 doesn't have mania, but it has a much stronger depression component to it.
So what is the, I don't want to get too far down into the weeds, but what's the, if it doesn't have the manic part of it and it just has the depression part of it, what's the difference between Bipolar 2 and just depression?
So people with Bipolar 2 have what's called hypomania, and that is it's a lesser version. There's no delusion. There's none of that gets associated with when you have full-blown mania, you're usually end up hospitalized because of the delusion component that comes in with it. With hypomania, you just get really interested in things, and you get a lot of energy. I'm sure I'm no doctor. I can just speak to how it manifests for me. And so people always call me the Energizer Bunny, and that's kind of a good description of it. When you see me at trade shows, and a lot of times, I'm talking very fast, and I'm, very organized, and I've got all these ideas, and you stay up all night trying to kind of enact all of your plans. That's hypomania. So it gets. A lot of people actually have hypomania that don't have bipolar. There's a book my husband bought me that's called The Hypomanic, How a Little Bit of Crazy Leads to Great Success. Very nice of him. But there's a lot of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies that have hypomania, but they don't have the coinciding depression. And so it's just something that gives you a lot of energy, a lot of focus. And for me, I'm fortunate enough that it translates into all of the work that I do. I know a lot of people aren't able to do that, but I'm very fortunate with that. And so normally it's just overly enthusiastic is how a lot of people kind of perceive it. And that's why it goes undiagnosed, because it's not super noticeable unless you point it out.
So once you were diagnosed, it sounds like you were living with the condition, dealing with it. and then you were diagnosed, and you were already taking medication, but then it sounds like they changed up the medication a little bit, or at least the dosage. How, after this was diagnosed and you realized, okay, this is what's going on, how did that must have been scary considering your career. Were you afraid for your career?
Not my career per se, mainly just because I always consider myself to be tangential to the firearms industry. I'm a historian. So yes, I work with firearms and I work with firearms collections, but I wasn't incredibly concerned about my academic standing per se. But I think the biggest frustration that I had was just kind of the way that we categorize people with mental illness. So, for example, when I was an expert on the assault weapons case, I would post like history snippets about certain features within, that were classified, quote unquote, as assault weapons under the California ban. And so I would make these historical posts, and I would have 2 or 3 times a post, people would comment and be like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for the work that you do to help the Second Amendment. If we could just keep guns out of the hands of crazy people, that'd be great. And that was after my, my diagnosis. And so I just heard a lot of that. And I certainly understand the sentiment where people are coming from, but there was a lot of that. And then finally, I got fed up because I heard a USCCA commercial on the radio in Phoenix. And it was basically, they said the word crazy like 15 times in 30 seconds. They're like, this person's crazy and you don't want a crazy person. It was so over the top. And I looked at my husband, I'm like, I got pretty thick skin, but that's kind of hurtful. And so I had already been introduced to Walk the Talk America before that, but they did not know about my diagnosis. And so after I heard that commercial, I kind of typed them up an email and asked if I could talk a little bit more about myself and what I was going through. And so I actually did their podcast and came out, I guess, of sorts. And so I was fortunate that I wasn't concerned about my career as much as it made me sad the way that we casually talk about things that people are internally struggling with, and knowing that it does have very real concerns and ramifications for other people within our industry.
So the phrasing obviously could be a lot better. And that's a really interesting point, and I hadn't really thought about it. But I mean, even our organization says that, hey, we defend the rights of the sane, trained, and law-abiding. I'm hoping that that's the right way to phrase it, but beyond terminology, what are we getting wrong as far as policy? What should be or could be better when it comes to, public policy, firearms, and mental health?
Now, I'm not an expert in that, although I am joining the board of Walk the Talk America. And I know if you look up any of Michael Sedini's videos on it, they talk a lot about the extreme risk protection orders, because that does have a lot of impact on people who have mental health diagnoses. From my perspective, just kind of over the years before I even knew that I had a mood disorder, I did attend symposia on mental health and firearms just out of an area of interest, because part of my academic area of study is how the brain perceives things and how the brain remembers, and then how that impacts our understanding of firearms in culture and throughout history. So I had a little bit of that before. And I went to a symposium specifically when I was in undergrad in Delaware, and they talked about how it's similar to, all gun laws, how there's people just don't understand the policies that are in place, and then also how easily it can be for there to be unintended consequences. And the person that was speaking there was talking about a couple of bills that were being proposed in Delaware about 10 years ago. And one, how the fact that when you hear somebody that has a mental health issue, the assumption is that they're, going to be violent, especially mood disorders like schizophrenia. And the reality is that mental health is as wide a spectrum as there are firearms, and so when you start trying to label people, in black and white, like gun owners hate, when people label gun owners and guns that we own in black and white, we almost in the gun community often paint people with mental health issues black and white, and pretty much everyone does. And so understanding that there's a spectrum here and acknowledging that suicide is a really major issue within our community is important. But I think just kind of from the people trying to understand the laws is realize that as much as we can sit here and talk about the assault weapons ban or the magazine ban and how utterly confusing that is to us, it's also utterly confusing for a lot of people on the other side who are dealing with medical issues, disability issues, who are perfectly capable of owning firearms, but might be, subject to a lot of the laws that are going into place for various reasons.
So how do we, maybe this is above both of our pay grades, but how do we, where do we draw that line? Like, what can you say about advice on where that line is drawn? Like, how do we determine if somebody is, maybe has too much of a mental crisis going on to own a firearm, and someone that isn't? Like, how do we determine that? What kind of advice do you have, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my gut would say that we don't get to determine that, about people. But, I think that
maybe more accurately, how does it get determined? If what?
That's a great question. I honestly, I know from my own, personal mental health, it is insulting when you hear people say that those who have mental health concerns shouldn't have firearms, because I'm perfectly capable of owning them and having them safe. You're right. I mean, there are a lot of concerns there, and that is, 2/3 of firearms deaths are by suicide. And so it's a difficult line, and I'm going to be honest, I don't have it. I would love to, I work with Walk the Talk. I hope that we can start to try to kind of create concepts and ideas, and I'm sure that they both, the two guys that run it, both, have really great ideas behind that. But as of right now, the laws that are in place are usually the 4473 says somebody that's been committed or involuntarily committed to a mental health organization or institution. And I was reading the state laws before I came on here, and some are involuntary, some are adjudicated with a mental health crisis in the court system. So those are the things that are put in right now. And then some of them have like a 5-year time frame of after 5 years, then, if you are, doing better health-wise, that you can, acquire your firearms again. But those are just things that are on the books. And to be perfectly honest, I know history. I don't know today. So I'd like to know more
I can
about
totally
how
see
those work and whether they work.
Yeah, I can totally say. If we're honest, I think it's fair to say that gun owners are afraid sometimes of all the infringements, all these laws. We just had an attorney on talking about how most of the room here, we're going to become felons once the ruling goes into place, banning the possession of normal capacity magazines. And I think it's probably easy and tempting to just kind of scuttle the entire issue, or I should say people that have any kind of mental health concerns or issues, and just say, hey, that's not me, throw them out. Okay, you guys don't get guns, or blame it all on them.
Yeah.
I could see how that'd be extremely easy, but what do you want people to know? We have like 2 more minutes. What do you want people to know about firearms owners and people with mental health concerns? Like, if you could kind of paraphrase it, what would you say? What do you want to make sure our listeners know?
Well, I think what I would love for the listeners to know is not so much what people should know about those who have mental health and firearms, but for people that do have mental health issues and firearms, to know that they're not alone. There's a big concern out there about firearms being taken away if you have depression or anxiety, and it's very isolating to feel like, you are aware of your capabilities, you're aware of your limits within, your disorders, but then you feel like there's no one else out there, and that they don't get to talk about it because you're afraid to talk about it. When I came out on the podcast and I made a post on my social media, I had a handful of DMs really quickly, and some other text messages from people who are prominent figures within the gun community, the gun industry, tell me that they had bipolar 2, or that they had other things that they were dealing with that I had no idea. I knew them very, very well, and I had no idea, but that they're afraid to say anything. And I think, letting those people know that they're not alone, and then hopefully someday being able to provide an outlet so that we can have a much more productive dialogue on it, because I think the firearms community has actually done a lot of really good work on suicide prevention, what NSSF does, a lot of the veterans organizations. And so, that conversation's already there. And we just need to find a way to bring everybody in and feel like they can have that conversation in a safe way, so that we can keep people safe and healthy and protected, but then also not alienate them and make them feel like they don't have a community anymore.
That's cool. Well,
Ashley, you should have your own radio show.
I know, right? She's really interesting.
I'm serious, girl.
You know who's jealous that I get to interview her is my nephew Sam. He's a big fan of yours. I have a nephew that's a huge fan of yours, Ashley.
You should.
Oh, awesome. Well,
You should
like,
send her this show, because when you hear Sam at the end of the show, we try to stump him.
Yeah.
With
gun trivia.
Gun trivia. I'm telling you, girl, he will curl your hair. And how old is he? 20?
He just turned 22.
Just turned 22.
Oh,
And
awesome.
he is an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
Or if you're not doing anything, you can get on a computer and listen to us on Facebook.
There you go. Well, how do people follow you? Do you have a website or anything?
Yeah, so my social media, I'm at HistoryInHeels on Instagram, and then I'm just Ashley Lubinsky on Facebook. I always tell people I have a Twitter, but Twitter's toxic, so I don't actually use it.
Right.
And then I do have a website that's theguncode.com, but most people, my work is word of mouth. Most people, if you just reach out to me on Instagram or Facebook, I'm pretty easy to find. And then I also have a podcast with the current curator of the Cody Firearms Museum, and that's History Unloaded, and you can find that on all your podcast platforms.
Perfect. It's really fun talking to you. So you take care. Have a great week, and I got a sneaky feeling we will be talking to you down the road.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching this clip from Gun Owners Radio. You can watch us live every Sunday from 4 to 6 p.m. California time, right here on our YouTube channel, or if you're in the San Diego area, you can listen to us on 1170 a.m. We're also available on your favorite podcast platform for free. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can help restore and protect the Second Amendment, not just in California, but across the country.